Welcome to another episode of The Crypto Exchange, a Troutman Pepper Locke podcast focusing on the world of digital assets. I'm Genna Garver, a partner at Troutman Pepper Locke. Before we jump into today's episode, let me remind you to visit and subscribe to our blogs, consumerfinancialserviceslawmonitor.com and troutmanfinancialservices.com. And don't forget to check out our other podcasts at troutman.com/podcasts. Today, I'm joined by John D'Agostino, head of strategy for Coinbase Institutional and co-founder of AIMA's Digital Asset Working Group, to discuss crypto's big moment following yesterday's Senate vote to approve the Genius Act and the Clarity Act expected soon on the House floor. I've had the pleasure of knowing John for many years. He's well known and respected in the institutional investment industry, and he's held numerous leadership positions and fancy titles. You can check out his full bio on our podcast episode webpage. When you layer in all his interests and hobbies, John could easily be a contender for Dos Equis' most interesting man in the world. John, thank you for joining me today.
That's the best intro I've ever had, Jenna. Thank you. And the credibility is in your direction as well. I've enjoyed working with you, and you have a fantastic reputation along with Troutman Pepper Locke.
Thanks, John. This is going to be a fun one.
Yep.
To quote Penny Lane from the best movie ever, Almost Famous, it's all happening. Just in the past few days, as I've already mentioned, we had, yesterday the Senate voting 68-30 on the Genius Act. And that's going to, if it finally becomes law, establish a U.S. regulatory framework for permitted payment stablecoins, which are basically U.S. dollar cash equivalents. And the House committees last week moving the Clarity Act to the House floor. And that will hopefully bring some clarity, air quotes, to the U.S. regulatory status for digital assets and their intermediaries. We have an announced partnership between Alchemy and Ripple that could essentially allow people to access Ripple's US-backed stablecoin using payment methods that I know about, like credit cards and Apple Pay, and JP Morgan filing for trademarks for what I guess people are speculating to be its stablecoin. The fate of the SEC Ripple settlement and the permanent injunction. We've got, last but not least, Coinbase seeking SEC approval for tokenized equity offerings, which could make it a competitor with, Robinhood and others. So, oh my gosh, what a freaking week. So, John, what's the word on the street?
Yeah, look, this is audio only, so your viewers can't see the goofy grin I've got on my face right now, because it is really fun. I think let's just start from the basic principles, right? So this isn't necessarily new momentum. This is sort of released momentum that had been locked up for 5 to 7 years because of this bizarrely antagonistic regulatory environment that we had here in the US. And, I don't want to get too much into it because we've done a ton of work on debanking and all of that. But let's just say a switch was flipped, not just at the executive level, but at the regulatory level. And this kind of showed the enormous appetite, not just at the retail level, not just at the gaming space, as we talk about, meme coins and people kind of using crypto for entertainment value, but at the infrastructure layer of how we think about payments and money. And people want it. Companies, large companies want it. And we're seeing that unlock happen. It's almost like an unwinding. This all should have happened over 5 years. And it's happening over several months now because of that unlock.
Yeah, I was actually trying to figure out how many years ago was the first digital asset working group call. It feels like forever ago. And now I feel like all of this momentum, and here I feel like we're ending up perhaps exactly where we were hoping to go, which is having a USD dominance. There are so many things that could flow from this. But the real question is, assuming the Genius Act, the Clarity Act, assuming that, we get full congressional approval and real law here, is that the last hurdle for institutional players to jump in?
No, there's never a last hurdle. I was at a conference yesterday, and I was listening to some institutional players, some very large banks, and they were talking about, regulatory uncertainty. And it kind of struck me. I'm old enough now to be able to look back a few decades, and I sat to myself and thought, I don't think I've ever been to an institutional conference on any financial topic, anything, whether it was my old world in commodities or my new world in crypto, where regulatory uncertainty wasn't mentioned.
Well, thank God, because I'd be out of the job, John.
Exactly. So there's going to be first adopters and non-first adopters, and the non-first adopters generally point to regulatory uncertainty as kind of the go-to standard reason for why they're not being first adopters. So that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I do think that's fairly accurate. So meaning there will always be something. So I think tax rules are probably next. The IRS is still kind of punitive vis-a-vis digital assets. I think we have some Basel requirements in Europe that need to be overcome. So there's still these places where crypto is sort of bizarrely singled out without really any other reason besides it was new and it scared us. And so we put in these sort of draconian, individualized rules that just block crypto. And what I think will happen is those will get taken out much, much faster because the market participants in those parts of the world will say, wait a second, now we're at a massive disadvantage. This thing is taking off like gangbusters. We're going to lose customers because they like being able to send money in seconds versus days. And they like being able to do it securely and quickly and cheaply versus it taking a long time and costing 4 to 9%. So I do think the US moving first on this and moving fast and big on this unlocks for rest of world. But I still think we have some IRS issues, some tax issues in the US and a few other things. But make no mistake, this is a massive, massive move.
It's funny because I don't know that I would normally think of the US being like a first mover in this space. I have felt like we've been playing catch up, but I do think that we are a key for institutional players and to have like ease of it, those international transactions. I am curious though, like if we're still going to see a lot of restraint until we have final rules that will then be required by this legislation, including, again, if passed as proposed, CFTC rules and safety and soundness standards for this new classification of digital asset custodians. So I'm curious, like there's so much uncertainty, even just thinking of like the CFTC as being the regulator to set those types of standards for safekeeping and how, I know Emma's really been focused on custody. Like me, they've probably been focusing more like in terms of SEC rules on being a qualified custodian and what that means on the asset manager side. So like, has this kind of opened up a whole can of worms that needs to be resolved? Or have institutional players sort of made peace with the safekeeping options and infrastructure currently available?
So I'm not a lawyer, as you know, and I'll stand by my initial point is that some institutions who are by nature slow and conservative and cautious will continue to cite uncertain regulatory activity.
That's fair.
But I'll just point to, it's funny, like we do lots of other things at scale with regulatory uncertainty. So avoiding effectively connective income by season and sell, right? So not to change topics, but there's a thing called season and sell, which is, right? So hundreds of billions of dollars utilize this. You want your offshore fund not to get ECI. And so basically you let's percolate for 45 to 180 days. You sell it to the fund. Magically, it all goes away. I talk to lawyers today, and this is going on for 15, 20 years. I talk to lawyers today who still say, that shouldn't work. That's just, but it does. At some point, the industry just says, okay, we can't get clarity the way we want it. So we just move on.
True.
So there's some big, I think the lack of any law was an insurmountable obstacle for big banks. But I think having just any basic law, there's always going to be small levels of regulatory uncertainty. But at some point, it reaches a point where you're saying, what's the probability of the regulator coming in and crushing a $50, $100, $200 billion business over some nuanced, reading of a rule? We get comfortable with that uncertainty. And I think it's about to happen fast. If you have any doubt of that, JP Morgan, whose CEO is pretty vocal about his distrust of all things crypto, announced quite publicly that this internal blockchain effort that they've had since 2015, mind you, is now running a permissioned stablecoin for JP Morgan clients to transfer value with each other in cooperation with Coinbase on the Base network. And that came out yesterday. So I think you'll see them moving pretty fast, faster than you might think, because again, I think this has been stalled for 5 years. There's been groups within all of these big banks. They've gone through like 6 rounds of employees because they hired everybody 5, 7 years ago that were really excited. Those people got frustrated, went to crypto native firms, and they've kept them alive. And now the people who are sitting in those seats now, you're going to start to see really coming into their own and moving things along faster.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the term innovation being in the title of these bills.
Genna, I know the people that were there 5 years ago at Citi, JP Morgan. They're now in crypto because they got frustrated, but they're jealous of the people who I think are sitting in those seats now because they're like, damn, I was in that seat. If we would have done this 5 years ago, I'd be the one doing it at JP Morgan. I mean, they're happy where they are, but I think it was just a timing issue.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the current seat holders are standing on their shoulders. I want to go back to a point you mentioned earlier about, international competition. And I think the perspective that I've always been kind of looking at this with is seeing the industry flee because, of course, as a US lawyer, like I want there to be like action here in the US so we can make the magic happen here as opposed to like advising people on what you can't do here and whether you should go somewhere else or how to do that. And, I do think Congress was very concerned about like the total drop off in activity over the past however many years. I think it's probably going back more than 5 years now, where the early days of this, we saw a huge interest and then it basically flee offshore. So if this passes, assuming it's one package, but let's just say if the bills pass, do you think that movement will be enough to entice industry participants to come back onshore? Like, is it safe to come back onshore now?
The short answer is yes. The short answer is absolutely. Now there's other reasons to go offshore. But I mean, if you're a European citizen, to go to the UAE and live without taxes is pretty darn nice, right? That's tough too. But in terms of where companies want to domicile, I do think places like the UAE, Singapore, Hong Kong, they took advantage of that 5 to 7 year sort of bizarre antagonism towards innovation, and they've established beachheads that will not be easily overcome because they're good places to work. You can raise a family there. If you're non-US, you get wonderful tax treatment. So, but I do think that what's happened now in the US has dramatically slowed the level of growth for US companies and people who really did not want to move to the UAE. You don't get a ton of tax advantages moving to the UAE if you're a US citizen. I do think it slowed demonstrably that outflow. And again, it's really hard to overstate. I mean, the US has always been a tricky place to do business. We have the world's most credible capital markets. There's a reason for that. Our regulators have never been perceived to be easy to work with. But the last 5 to 7 years was different because as tough a regulatory body as FINRA is or CFTC or SEC has ever been, they were always fair and they were always rules-based. And we lost that for 5 to 7 years. So we got to a point where people were genuinely scared to have an open conversation with the SEC because they were literally worried they'd be recorded and it would be weaponized against them. So it's the first time in my career I've ever seen that. That's gone. And so that fear is over. Now, some people are talking about, well, how durable is this change? Because what if the pendulum swings back the other way politically, and then you get people installed who are as bad, if not worse, than before? I think that's unlikely, just because I think that politicians now recognize running on an anti-innovation agenda isn't really good politics. So I think while pendulum always swings back a little bit,
right,
back and forth a bit, but I think the days of installing people who are openly adversarial and hostile to innovation and technology, artificial intelligence, blockchain, et cetera, I think those days are gone, at least for the foreseeable future.
Right.
The stat I keep going back to is 52 million Americans have bought crypto. That's roughly the same number of Americans that have chosen to purchase stock. And this is NASDAQ number, not people who own stock. They own through pensions and 401ks. That's much bigger. 52 million Americans roughly have made the conscious decision to purchase a share of stock on an E-Trade or whatever account. It's roughly the same number of Americans who purchase crypto. And so I think Washington and politicians realize that now. They realize you don't pick up a single vote being anti-crypto, but you lose a lot being anti-crypto. So I'm hopeful this is durable. I'm hopeful those days are over. I'm encouraging people now, and I stopped doing it. I'm encouraging folks to talk to the SEC, talk to the CFTC, share your ideas. You may be told no, by the way. They may say, no, we don't think what you're doing is okay. But I think that we're back to an era of good faith regulatory relationships.
And on that note of speaking to the regulators, personally, I can't say that I have complete clarity, having read the Clarity Act, as to when an asset's a security. But that aside, I'm sure I'm not the only one. I know AMA and other industry participants have been providing comments to the SEC's crypto task force. I've been involved in the National Society of Compliance Professionals' efforts on the same. And if the Clarity Act is that clear and would be looking to the CFTC as the primary regulator in this space, where does that leave the SEC's efforts, and where does that leave this task force? I mean, I take your point that the pendulum always swings. We don't know who's going to be ahead of the SEC in the future and what their views might be in terms of the extent of their jurisdictional turf in that turf war. But I think I agree with you that with respect to this issue, while I agree everything's cyclical, the pendulum swings, and there will be a turf war likely in the future, it'll probably be on something else, like as it was in the last cycle 10 years ago between the SEC and the CFTC and Dodd-Frank and dealing with security swaps. This isn't security swaps, this is digital assets, and the next time it's not going to be digital assets, it'll be something else. But still, we've got some overlap, or maybe not overlap at this moment in time when an asset might be a security and then a digital commodity, or who the heck knows, because it's all subject to further rulemaking.
And it can start as one and turn into another, right?
Right. It's the ultimate transformer.
That's right. Yeah.
We'll find out, I guess, in the rulemaking process. But do you think that people should still be putting their efforts into working with this task force and the staff of the SEC
Yes.
to make sure that we have coherent and
Yes.
at least meeting of the minds on how to deal with this
Mhm.
with respect to asset management going forward?
I absolutely do, because I think for the first time in a very long time, we're going to have commissioners and staff of these two agencies that are going to be shockingly cooperating for the benefit of this country. So I think we have a short term, we have a couple of years where you've got Paul Atkins, Brian Quintenz. Look, they're going to want to carve out their own fiats. They're aggressive people. You've got people like Cowan Pham and Hester Peirce. You have people who genuinely want to move this forward. And they'll fight for their fiats, of course. But I think we have a brief window where you have enough firepower at these agencies who are willing to work together to better our capital markets. There will be no shortage of things to own. You're going to have tokenized securities. You're going to have certain aspects that are commodities. You'll have certain crypto that's absolutely going to be a security. You'll have certain crypto that's not going to be a security. It's going to be a collectible. The SEC still will be in charge of maintaining orderly and fair markets and looking at things like insider trading. The CFTC will still be in charge of ensuring that commodity markets are organized fairly, that clearing agencies are well capitalized. There's so much to grab in terms of control. I have no doubt that these agencies will fight, because obviously the more they control, the bigger their budgets are. But we do seem to have this wonderful brief window where everybody wants to come in, take a breather and say, let's get rid of all the toxic crap that happened over the last 5 to 7 years. Let's see where we stand. We're about to shift. I mean, to me, this is as important as when I was at the NYMEX 20 years ago and we moved from open outcry trading to electronic trading. This is a seminal transition of where we are for capital markets. And just like moving from open outcry to electronic trading unlocked trillions of dollars of value because these markets became so much more efficient. It was a jump step up from open outcry. We're going to have that same jump step up now. And to go from T3 to T1 to T15 seconds, we have the chance to do that now. So yeah, they're going to fight and stuff. But look, it's funny, Joe, you mentioned this, swaps are really funny, right? So if you have a composite swap, if you have two assets under a swap, it's one regulatory agency. But if it's a single asset swap, it's another regulatory agency, right? So we will wind up with kind of a fakakta sort of mix, I'm sure. It's the nature of having these dual agencies. But we have this brief kind of multi-year window where we can sort of try to push as far away from where we were the last 7 years as we can.
So I want to pick up on a point you just mentioned about the quickness of things to come and, moving away. I mean, we've gone from T+2, T+1, 24/7 trading on the horizon. I want you to tell us what you can a bit more about Coinbase's recent SEC request. It's starting to feel, though, like we're entering a realm where maybe there's not going to be any downtime. And, you remember 20 years ago. I remember when I was first practicing law and being in the BlackBerry pilot program, first getting set up with Citrix to work from home. And the shift in my life from being available 24/7 even with a cell phone. So if what you're about to tell me is going to lead us to this 24/7 trading situation, which is very different than what we have right now, where you can trade in any of the 24 hours, 7 days a week, but it's a 5 o'clock somewhere. That's very different than it just being like a groundhog day of a trading session. And so, will it be safe to go to sleep ever again without the fear of a potential market movement while you're unconscious? Like, should I be going long caffeine now? Is the question.
So here's the funny thing. Even when markets close, they're still open. Meaning just because technically the crude oil market stops at, whatever, 3:30, whatever it is on the CME, that market trades overnight globally. What'll happen is, though, you'll wake up in the morning and it'll gap up or down demonstrably, and you don't have the ability to participate in overnight. So there's nowhere to think about markets as ever being really closed. They're always open. You just can't participate. Other people can participate in the physical or spot market or elsewhere. So that's one school of thought, is that it actually releases tension, build up tension to have that be able to trade overnight. Now, you're bringing up a very good point, though, and somebody I really, really respect, Alex Lipton, who's the global quantitative chief at Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. He and I have had this discussion, and he is concerned about if we ever move. I don't think we're anywhere close to this, but if we literally did move to like liquid 24/7 instantaneous settlement trading, Alex's view is that markets occasionally need time to absorb information calmly and reset. That's why we have circuit breakers and things like that. I don't necessarily disagree with him. And so I think the right answer will be somewhere in the middle, meaning I don't think we'll have fully liquid active trading 24/7. I mean, some people might think, well, AI bots will trade these markets 24/7. I think there's a natural ebb and flow to liquidity. People need time to absorb information. People need time to rest and think about what their move the next day. In a theoretical world where it's just AI bots trading with AI bots, then why not have it be 24/7? But we're not really there yet. So I think we'll gradually approach this. But I do think in the short term, it's important to remember my first point, which is just because you think the market's closed doesn't mean price isn't actually moving. And it's, as a general thesis, it's better to be able to trade on that market when information comes than not trade. And if you're sleeping through it, there's no difference between when you wake up and when you don't. If you don't wake up or you wake up, but give people the optionality and give institutions the optionality to transact on a real-time basis.
So I love that. That's such a great perspective. It just brings like the human element to this. And especially since we're so focused on AI these days and machines taking over the world. And it just reminds me of a conversation I recently had with my buddy Joe Cox, who always reminds me it's man or woman plus machine. Like, there is a human element. It does need to be absorbed, not just by a bot.
I love Joe. Joe is great. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's just such a great perspective to have that you can sleep. There are ways to handle that. It's happening already and we handle it now, but this isn't just about setting a robot and like letting things go. Like, there is a human element to this. So I really do appreciate your thoughts on that. And I think it's not just about 24/7 trading, but this idea that we could trade in anything. And as like sort of the last discussion point here, I really want to turn to what's going on with Coinbase, and to the extent that you can speak to it, because I don't know that tokenized offerings of interest that we normally think of as securities or liquid assets that could be traded as such is something that everyone necessarily thinks of in the general population when you talk about crypto. I think it's probably more thought of as like a cash equivalent, but to be able to take assets that you wouldn't normally think of in that category and to be able to turn them into a liquid tradable thing is really fascinating, in addition to the instant liquidity and 24/7 aspect of it. So could you please share with us some of the plans on that front?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in theory, when you have really efficient tradable systems like the way blockchains and tokens allow, I think there's this kind of philosophical theory that everything can be liquid. I don't necessarily ascribe to that. I think a lot of things can become liquid that aren't currently. Stablecoins, for example, Tether, USDC, they are just attempts to monetize treasuries, because treasuries themselves are a little bit clumsy and burdensome to transact with. And that's been wildly successful. So I could see other things being monetized that we think of as like almost like money. So gold, for example, maybe certain precious commodities like crude oil. We probably can improve liquidity embedded in real estate transactions. Anything where there's a buy-sell demand, but it's the friction in the middle that's causing the problem. blockchain and tokenization is magical. Now, where it's not magic, so decreasing the friction associated with a buy and a sell isn't helpful if there's no interest in buying and selling, right? If I want to sell you a bad piece of real estate, it doesn't help if I just make it easier to buy the bad piece of real estate. So people shouldn't pretend that, I'm going to tokenize. I hear this a lot. I want to tokenize my fund. Okay, well, why do you want to do that? And then when you ask a few questions, you realize, I want to tokenize my fund because I have a bad performing fund and no one intelligent will purchase my fund anymore the traditional way. So I think if I just wrap it up in this shiny new thing called tokenization, people will magically want to buy my bad fund. Well, that's not solving anything.
Okay, well, wait, let's pause for a second. Let's hope that no one has actually said that to you, but I understand that's what
they don't say that, of course. But you ask questions like, well, how come why can't you just raise money through LP and you realize, your fund has underperformed the S&P for 10 years.
Yeah, and it feels gimmicky, right?
It does. I
mean, in that space, that's our space that we come from beyond crypto is hedge fund space.
Right, but tokenizing bad real estate is not going to magically make it good real estate, right? But there's a ton of assets where there's real latent demand and the ability. We saw this in the art market. We saw, fractional securitization of the art market was really successful. So tokenization is that on steroids. So there's tons and tons of assets. I don't think it's everything in the world, but there's tons of assets that you can monetize through tokenization. Stablecoins are just kind of the beginning of that. I expect gold, I expect crude oil, natural gas, precious metals, maybe rare earth metals. I expect the decreased friction associated with tokenization to unlock liquidity in all of those highly sought after but cumbersome assets.
Okay, so with respect to putting equities on the blockchain, to tokenize equities so that they can be tradable, tell me what Coinbase is doing.
Well, I can't tell you much because we just made the announcement that we're seeking regulatory approval. Obviously, I think Robinhood announced this before us. So they probably have a little more out there. You can read about it. But the idea is fairly simple, right? Again, just like I told you, I went from open outcry. We used to trade physical stock certificates around an oak tree. That led to exchanges using punch cards. Then that led to open outcry with like computer centralized databases in the basement of the NYMEX. Then we moved to electronic trading. And now we're moving to tokenization. So if you believe that blockchains are better ways, all an exchange is a trusted mechanism to transfer risk. That's all it is. Some people think, it's transferring value. It's not really. Exchanges transfer risk. I move risk from me to you. And the exchange provides a centralized place to gather up all that interest. And then it provides, in some cases, it provides a trusted counterparty so I don't have to worry about your credit risk. That's all exchanges are. They're buildings where trust lives, right? So if we think blockchains are better ways of organizing people and trust, organizing trusted groups of people, then that function should shift to blockchain. So we're going to see Coinbase and Robinhood and others are going to try to do it. And we're going to see if people prefer this mechanism of transferring risk, this trusted way of transferring risk to the other way and my guess is they'll live side by side for some period of time because it's still two very different types of people that transact in this. I think about this a lot. My mother still has a landline. And I kind of make fun of her.
Yeah, or goes to the bank instead of the ATM. That's what I was going to say.
That's right. My mother still has a landline. And I was kind of making fun of her for it. And then one day I decided to look it up. Almost 37% of this country still uses a landline. I haven't used one in 15 years. I can't even imagine having one in my home. But a decent portion of America still uses a landline. And I asked my mom why she wants it. And it feels more trustworthy to her. And so I think people stick to the systems they trust. So I see these existing side by side for maybe even a full generation. But then eventually, just like with open outcry to electronic, the better technology wins out.
Yeah. And, though, I think specifically in the securities transfer space, I think we'll get there quicker. And it may be that yesterday will be the last day I have to answer a question about a medallion signature guarantee, which is one of the ways in which transfer agents have been trying to gain that trust. And they're basically having to, guarantee and be responsible for guaranteeing the accuracy, the trustworthiness of the transaction. So I think this is all super fascinating.
I pray, Genna, I'll never have to get anything notarized ever again someday. Like I hope I don't die before notaries go away. This notion that like you'll only trust me if some random person puts a stamp on a piece of paper. It's just so comical, right? So we know these things are going away. It's simply a matter of when.
Well, I could talk to you forever. We never run out of things to say. Hopefully, everyone else has found it as interesting as I have. And, I really do thank you for taking the time to join me today. I'm sure you are in incredible demand this week.
Anytime, Jenna. For you, anything.
Well, I really do appreciate that. And thanks to our audience for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to visit our blogs and subscribe so you can get the latest updates. I'm sure we're going to be having some very interesting conversations in the coming weeks, given all of this activity. So please also make sure to subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher. Never even heard of that, just to make fun of myself for a second, or whatever platform you use. And we look forward to our next episode. Thanks again.
Copyright Troutman Pepperlock LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman does not make any representations or warranties, expressed or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepperlock. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.